earth, the creatures that you love sinned. And since you're an infinitely just being, you can't allow them not to be punished. But since you are an infinitely loving being, you decide to come down to earth and pay the price of their sin for them. So you come down to this place, and 1 week before you're going to be sacrificed, you come down to this place, you get on a donkey. You don't come in on a white horse. You don't come in with a fleet of F-15s. You come down on a donkey. And when you get to this point, your disciples say, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees who had been following him around said, "Rebuke your disciples." And he says, if they don't say something, the very stones will cry out. And as he gets to this point, he looks at the city and he begins to weep. Imagine you start crying. You've taken on human nature and you start crying because you know what's coming to this city in about 40 years. Because in Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse, it's called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus was on the Mount of Olives when he gave it. And he was looking down at the temple and he says, "Not one stone will be left upon another." And then he gets to the point where he says, "The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky." Then he says, "When these things happen, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power." And he says, when they ask him, "When will these things occur?" he says, "All these things will happen before this generation passes away." When did he say that? He said that in 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. That would have to happen by 70 AD. You say, but wait a minute, how can that happen by 70 AD? The sun didn't go dark, the moon didn't stop giving its light, the stars didn't fall from the sky. Where's the Son of Man? He doesn't come in the clouds. How can this be? Jesus is a false prophet. That's what many skeptics are now arguing. He predicted the end of the universe within one generation and it didn't happen. How can this be? Well, in order to understand the New Testament, you have to go back to the Old Testament, particularly if you're looking at the book of Matthew. Because as we mentioned earlier, Matthew's quoting the Old Testament over and over and over again, and so does Jesus. And when Jesus gets to the point where he says, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, where is he quoting from? He's quoting from Isaiah chapter 13. And what is that original reference? That is the language that was used about Babylon being judged by Cyrus. Because Babylon judged Jerusalem in 586 BC. They tore the temple down. That's why Herod had to build a new one. And Cyrus judged Babylon. And at the time, Isaiah said, it will be a time when the sun will not give its light, or the sun will go dark, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky. Did that really happen in 513 BC? No. Well, what's he using there? He's using something called apocalyptic language, which is a very strong way of expressing a literal truth, but he's not talking about it in a literal way. It would be like saying, we might use an idiom or an expression, where we say, that car cost me an arm and a leg. Well, when you say that, you don't think the person's a double amputee, right? You are using a strong way of saying a very forceful thing. We don't communicate in wooden literal prose. We communicate much like the Bible communicates. We use idioms, metaphors. We use strong language. Jesus used strong language over and over again. And when he's quoting from the Old Testament, he's using it in the same sense. But what about the Son of Man coming in the clouds? How can that be? That didn't happen in 70 AD. Well, if you look at Isaiah 19, the coming in the clouds, it says that Yahweh rides a cloud in judgment on Israel. What could you see? Now, Ruth mentioned this earlier. If you're in Jerusalem and there's an army descending on Jerusalem, he mentioned that we're high. No matter where you come from in this land, you're going to go up to Jerusalem. So if you're standing in Jerusalem, what could you see if an army was coming upon it? You would see a cloud of dust coming from the horses, from the chariots or whatever they had. You could see it from 100 miles away. That's why Luke puts in his Olivet Discourse, when you see armies descending on Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. Why? Because the judgment is coming. Now, if this meant to be the end of the world, and just the end of the world, would it make any sense to flee to the mountains? No, because that would be over too. So he's using this language to communicate that when you see this happening, get out of town. And most of the Christians did get out of town in 70 AD. They knew what was coming. The unbelievers didn't. They were slaughtered, as Josephus tells us. He called it the greatest war of all time. He said maybe up to 1 million people were killed. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Whatever it was, a lot of people were killed. Jesus was not a false prophet. He predicted it 40 years in advance. Yet, as we mentioned earlier, is there a longer-term fulfillment to this prophecy? Yes, there is. I think he is talking about a literal second coming as well. But the short-term fulfillment was the 70 AD judgment. And that judgment did occur. But notice in the Bible, there is nowhere in the Bible where this is said to have occurred. Nobody says, look, Jesus was right. Why does nobody say that? Because the documents are written prior to 70 AD. They were already written down. Nobody went back and said Jesus was right because all the documents had to be written, at least most of them. Maybe Revelation's written later, perhaps. Some say John is written later. I think John is written prior to 70 AD. In fact, tomorrow, I don't know if we're going to get a chance to do this, Raouf, but right over to the right of the sheep gate, which is over a little bit to our right, there's something called the Pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed some people who had gone down into the water. Well, it says in John 5, there is, near the sheep gate, the Pool of Bethesda. If he was writing after 70 AD, he wouldn't have said, there is near the sheep gate, the Pool of Bethesda. There was no sheep gate, there was no Pool of Bethesda after 70 AD. So he's writing this prior to 70 AD. Now Jesus wept. The God of the universe comes and weeps over the people that he loves. In another context, he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have loved to have gathered you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing. We all have free will to reject, and many do reject. Now, if the Lord of the universe is humble when he comes to earth, what are his followers supposed to be? We have no grounds to boast about anything, as Paul says on many occasions. If the Lord himself submits himself to our evil for our benefit and is humble doing it, we have no grounds to boast about anything. Everything we get comes from him anyway. Amen.